Hey everyone, and welcome to the 5 Bytes podcast. And now a roundup of this week's enterprise IT news highlights. Well, it's that time of the month again. It was Patch Tuesday this week, and Microsoft has addressed 120 flaws with this month's Windows updates. But good news, there's no 0 days disclosed this month, which that's interesting, and hopefully that's a trend going forward. But as of this week's Windows updates, according to bleepycomputer.com, Microsoft has fixed numerous vulnerabilities in Microsoft Office, Word, and Excel that could lead to remote code execution, amongst other vulnerabilities that have been patched. The total rundown of these vulnerabilities patched includes 61 elevation of privilege vulnerabilities, which is on the high end, 6 security feature bypass vulnerabilities, 31 remote code execution vulnerabilities, 14 information disclosure vulnerabilities, 8 denial of service vulnerabilities, and 13 spoofing vulnerabilities. So once again, I'm kind of seeing that trend. Now, there was 31 remote code execution vulnerabilities, which is quite high, but seeing that trend where there's one obvious type of vulnerability that makes up the bulk of the patches, and that is elevation of privilege vulnerabilities this month. So I mean, I haven't seen anything to corroborate this theory, but it kind of seems like maybe Microsoft's patching team and security teams focus on a certain category of vulnerabilities each month now. So that's kind of interesting. Some of the interesting vulnerabilities patched this month include CVE 2026 35421, and this is a Windows GDI remote code execution vulnerability. And this flaw can be exploited by opening a malicious enhanced meta file or EMF file using Microsoft Paint. Also, CVE 2026 40365. This is a Microsoft SharePoint Server remote code execution vulnerability that can allow an authenticated attacker to perform a network-based attack that remotely executes code on a SharePoint server, and also CVE 2026 41096. And this is a Windows DNS client remote code execution vulnerability where an attacker-controlled DNS server could send a specially crafted DNS response to a vulnerable Windows system using the DNS client to incorrectly process the response and corrupt memory. This would allow the attacker to run code on the vulnerable systems remotely. So despite there being no 0-day vulnerabilities this month, of course, it's imperative to patch early, patch often. That's easier to say than to do. You do want to be somewhat cautious, but organizations who continue to rely on, deploying last month's patches in the current month, you got to move on from that practice. Just look at the number of vulnerabilities being patched once again, 120 vulnerabilities patched. And if you're waiting possibly over a month to start rolling out these patches, you're really putting yourself at risk. Of course, other vendors have also released their own updates and patches as part of Patch Tuesday. I saw SAP were addressing pretty serious vulnerability, but of course, there's the likes of Cisco, Adobe, and the usual suspects as well. Bleepycomputer.com also reported recently on a new Linux 0-day exploit. This one's named Dirty Frag, and it allows local attackers to gain root privileges on most major Linux distributions, including Ubuntu, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, CentOS Stream, Alma Linux, OpenSUSE, Tumbleweed, and Fedora. Security researcher Hyunwoo Kim, who disclosed the vulnerability, published a proof of concept exploit saying that local privilege escalation was introduced roughly 9 years ago in the Linux kernel's ALGIF_AEAD cryptographic algorithm interface. Dirty Frag works by chaining two separate kernel flaws, the XFRM-ESP page cache write vulnerability and the RXRPC page cache write vulnerability to modify protected system files in memory without authorization, and can then achieve this privilege escalation. Unfortunately, at the time of recording this episode, it seems that for most Linux distributions, this has not yet been patched. Bleepycomputer.com does provide some details on some manual steps that you could take to help secure systems against attacks, including a command to run. And I'll share a link to that if you want to check it out for yourself with this episode. And you'll find that at 5bytespodcast.com under episode 439. Citrix announced a new Citrix Flex platform, and it was met with a bit of a frosty response from the community. In large part, I think this was due to how vague the announcement was. But from what I could tell from these vague announcements and viewing several of their videos and reading some blog posts, the Flex platform essentially will allow customers to use a credit-based service for providing a secure desktop offering to their employees. The configurations are based on work personas such as task workers, power workers. I think in one video they mentioned developer workers, etc. And that makes it kind of read like Windows 365 to me, in that it offers this kind of flat, predictable pricing, and it's based on whatever persona you select. So with Enterprise Windows 365 or Business Windows 365, or well, they now actually, I was about to say Frontline, they actually call Frontline Flex as well now. You can kind of pick and choose between different desktop or cloud PC specs, kind of based off of what your employees need. Whereas with the Citrix Flex platform, it's basically determining kind of what employees require based off of the user persona, which a lot of organizations have been looking at standardizing on personas, particularly to help streamline identity management, configuration and application management policies, etc. I don't know if all organizations are quite there yet, but maybe within these buckets or personas, there's something that will fit like those who are maybe outside that mold. And it kind of reads to me that, instead of necessarily being like new innovative technology, this is pulling together some of the existing Citrix technologies and doing an offering that's turnkey, kind of like Windows 365. Or saying Windows 365 is turnkey is maybe a little bit much, because you do still have to do some management and configuration. But in the same way that Windows 365 is turnkey, this could be a fully managed turnkey service offering. So you get the benefit of using cloud infrastructure for your desktops. You get the security stack that's pretty robust from Citrix to help enhance security around your desktops, and you get a predictable pricing model. So it might be attractive to some, although I feel like the launch of this offering may have been handled poorly by Citrix, because it left a lot more questions. It actually kind of reminded me of Omnissa's announcement, I think it was over 2 years ago, where they were announcing like their AI smart workspace idea. And unfortunately, in that instance, a lot of what they were talking about has yet to come to fruition. And similarly, they said after their kind of keynote or their announcement that they would have more information coming soon in blogs, and they didn't really deliver on the details within a short time frame. But hopefully Citrix does, because they did say that more details will be coming. But I will add that I feel like Citrix is well positioned for doing this type of offering, because they still do have the best protocol in HDX. They have built up a pretty significant stack within like monitoring, their DEX, security, etc. So they can have a very good offering. I did see that they were also flouting some of their enterprise browser features, as well as kind of leaning in to AI usage and perhaps providing oversight and control of the usage of AI for organizations. So I think that alone may turn some heads here, but we'll have to see. Unfortunately, in my opinion and in the opinion of the community, this kind of was a bit of a dud in terms of a reveal. But you know what? If the technology is there and it's solid, it could still be a success. CyberInsider.com reported that a federal jury has convicted a Virginia man for his role in a retaliatory cyber attack that wiped dozens of U.S. government databases after he and his twin brother were fired from a federal contractor in 2025. Now, I believe this is a story I covered on the podcast last year, but this is, I guess, a little bit of closure on that previous report, at least for one of the brothers. Prosecutors said the attack affected systems used by more than 45 federal agencies and deleted roughly 96 databases containing sensitive government information. The attack was a form of retaliation for being let go. They used a previously retrieved employee's password that seemed to be in plain text and they could access to access systems without authorization, right protecting databases so they couldn't be written to, deleting databases, and attempting to cover their tracks in the process. They were fired after it was discovered that they had previously pleaded guilty in 2015 to charges involving wire fraud and unauthorized access to government computers. Sentencing is expected on September 9th of this year, and he could face up to 21 years in prison. What's kind of crazy is that they were guilty in 2015 and obviously prosecuted and charged, yet they were able to get a job that involved sensitive government information and access to government systems again. Kind of crazy. The Register shared a report stating that 1 in 8 employees say selling credentials is justifiable. Mad. But even so, currently selling access to company systems is one of the less common types of fraud covered in the same survey that reported this statistic. But the 13% figure reflects respondents who said they had done it or knew someone who had, meaning that in a company of, say, 1,000 people, around 130 might report direct or indirect exposure to this behavior. Insane. Of course, even if it's a low number, you only need one person selling their credentials to a bad actor to cause absolute mayhem for an organization. Microsoft has reportedly fixed a known issue causing newly introduced Windows security warnings to display incorrectly when opening remote desktop files. And this is something that bubbled up, I think, about a month ago, so took quite a while to address. A remote desktop connection security warning dialog could potentially have rendered incorrectly in multi-monitor scenarios when the monitors had different scaling sets. The known issue affected all supported Windows versions, including Windows 11, Windows 10, and Windows Server on devices with multiple monitors and different display scaling settings. Microsoft has addressed the bug in an optional preview cumulative update for Windows 11 that was released recently, and this is KB 5083631, along with 34 other changes. I'm not entirely sure if this patch has also been rolled into the updates for this month. It does suggest in the advisory that it's part of Windows 11 servicing stack, so I'm guessing it has, but it was actually released at the end of last month as a optional update. So I'd say taking the May patches should also resolve the problem for you. The Verge has reported that Microsoft employees are being offered voluntary redundancy in the US, and they're being offered a lump sum payment, 5 years of health benefits, and 6 months of vesting for unvested stock options. The lump sum payment will depend on years of service and could be as much as 1 to 2 weeks of pay for every 6 months served, and those taking retirement reportedly have some slightly different terms, particularly around the healthcare benefits. So yeah, I mean, I already reported that there was talk of this occurring, and The Verge reported that they got these details before they were actually shared or published internally within Microsoft. So it seems like a bit of a leak. Not sure if this is 100% corroborated yet, but I mean, it gives credence to previous reports that Microsoft was going to be offering these voluntary retirement and redundancy packages. The Register recently reported that the UK government is defending its decision to put Palantir at the heart of their analytics within the NHS, which is the National Health Service. The US firm was awarded a contract to underpin the federated data platform after winning a succession of pandemic-era deals worth a combined £60 million without any competition. Palantir's NHS rollout in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland has attracted heated criticism, and that's not a surprise if you've seen the CEO of Palantir just speaking publicly. It is very worrying that such a powerful company has a leader who, I don't know, seems to be away with the fairies, quite frankly, just my opinion. The reported terms of the agreement have raised the ire of people due to the lack of defined deliverables and poor oversight, and also the fact that there was no competition. Now, being UK adjacent, I remember all the reports of pandemic era deals and contracts being signed within the United Kingdom. Like, I think there was some ferry service or some boat thing given to a company that had no actual fleet and no experience in maritime. And obviously, there was a whole PPE scandal as well. So I think a lot of dodgy deals were done around that time over in the UK. The UK government reportedly may look to break its contract with Palantir, but not just because of the poorly defined contract details, but for other reasons, including digital sovereignty and promoting innovation amongst UK companies. The UK Science Minister has said the decision is in the hands of the Department for Health and Social Care, but did promise to do something very different in the future. So I've reported on several stories over the last few months and maybe even more than a year about kind of a renewed concern around data and digital sovereignty. And this seems to be another example of that. Last Thursday, Mozilla provided a behind the scenes look into its use of Anthropic Mythos, which is the infamous AI model that's being used to identify software vulnerabilities. And Mozilla was able to ferret out 271 Firefox security flaws over 2 months of use. In a post, Mozilla engineers said the finally ready for prime time breakthrough that they achieved was primarily the result of two things. One, improvement in the models themselves, and two, Mozilla's development of a custom harness that supported Mythos as it analyzed Firefox source code. The engineers said their earlier brushes with AI-assisted vulnerability detection were fraught with unwanted slop. Typically, someone would prompt a model to analyze a block of code. The model would then produce plausible reading bug reports, and often at unprecedented scales. Invariably, however, when human developers further investigated, they'd find a large percentage of the details had been hallucinated, according to a report by Ars Technica. The humans would then need to invest significant work handling the vulnerability reports an old-fashioned way. Mozilla's work with Mythos was reportedly different. The biggest differentiating factor was the use of an agent harness, which is a piece of code that wraps around an LLM to guide it through a series of specific tasks. For such a harness to be useful, it requires significant resources to customize it to the project-specific semantics, tooling, and processes it will be used for. The article about this talks about the processes used for double validation, for example. So, not just accepting what has been reported, but actually using another large language model on top of Mythos to actually validate and confirm the truth of results. It claimed, in terms of the bugs coming out the other side, there are almost no false positives. So, a very high rate of accurate detection. Of the 271 bugs reportedly found using Mythos, 180 were deemed high severity. These types of vulnerabilities could be exploited through normal user behavior, such as browsing to a web page. And the only higher rating within Mozilla's own system is sec critical. So basically, they found multiple high severity vulnerabilities rather than critical vulnerabilities. However, another 80 that were found were moderate and 11 were low. So Mozilla is one of the companies in the circle of trust when it comes to early adoption and use of Mythos. Remains to be seen what waits for the world when Mythos becomes more widely available. In another report from Ars Technica, Don Ho, the legendary creator of Notepad++, has warned people about the unofficial Mac version that's out there, stating that someone is using the Notepad++ trademark without permission. This is misleading, inappropriate, and frankly disrespectful to both the project and its users, he wrote. And he went on to say, it has already fooled people, including tech media, into believing this is an official release. To be crystal clear, Notepad++ has never released a macOS version. Anyone claiming otherwise is simply writing on the Notepad++ name. Yeah, so put some respect on the Notepad++ name. It's an amazing product, continues to be an amazing product, and it's something I use every week, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. It'd be nice if there was a Mac version though, so maybe this will be the fire under their ass to get them to release a macOS version. Tom'sHardware.com reported that Mark Russinovich says that Windows 11 still relies on a bunch of old code from the 1990s. And I mean, that's not really that surprising because that's been something that's been talked about over the many years. But Tom's Hardware suggests at least that it's refreshing for Microsoft's Azure Chief Technology Officer to highlight this fact on social media, but it's not going to be a surprise to anyone who's been paying attention. But as Russinovich puts it, those invested in the computer scene in the 90s were thinking that, we'd have moon stations by the year 2026 and flying cars, not Win32. The admission that such old software tech is still the bedrock of Windows today may be strategically sharing a cold, hard truth, providing a let's be real moment as part of Microsoft's latest charm offensive, according to tomshardware.com. And honestly, I don't know if it's even a charm offensive, right? This is just the reality. And it's been something that has been talked about quite a bit for a long time. And I know Microsoft have kind of been at pains and under efforts to try and get others to move away from bad programming practices and relying on old frameworks and such. However, then you look at the Windows OS and there's quite old code still in there. Mark reportedly said, quote, I think one of the reasons it's got this staying power is just a fundamental layer inside of Windows that so many apps have built on. So many technologies and ecosystems have been built on top of it that it's kind of a bedrock, end quote. He went on to explain that Win32 has persisted even when facing targeted existential threats from within Microsoft, particularly in the Windows 8 era, saying, quote, there's been various times in Microsoft's history where we thought we'd reboot the Windows API surface, like WinRT, that actually didn't play out the way a lot of people expected it to, end quote. Yeah, but if you look at WinRT, you kind of understand why it failed. Yeah, it's good to have a target to modernize and to replace, but the replacement has to be adequate. In closing, Russinovich highlights that Win32 was also the bedrock for tools like Sysmon and Zoomit, which obviously are part of the sysinternals tools that Mark Russinovich himself has founded. And these tools are more relevant now as part of Windows 11 and PowerToys. So I don't know if anyone wants to hear my opinion anymore. I do try to throw it in every once in a while. Some people have told me that they like that more. They want me to kind of opine on some of the things I'm reporting on and not just report, but then other people don't like when I do this. However, I'm going to do it anyways because it's my podcast. This is kind of a cathartic experience for me every week. I think what I just said, Microsoft has to provide a suitable alternative that's modern, not just, hey, use this. This is our modern attempt. That's that. I mean, they could do that, with Windows OS releases in the past, say pre-Windows 10, they did take some hard lines and it did force some change. But then Microsoft itself has to be able to adopt these modern alternatives. When Microsoft says, hey, use MSIX, there's fundamental problems with MSI, for example, and the Windows installer service hasn't had a meaningful update since Windows 7. But then MSIX was kind of left to flounder from 2018 until recently. And Microsoft themselves were so late to the party in getting some of their own applications into MSIX. And they kind of shot themselves in the foot a little bit of saying, hey, you should use MSIX. And then they open up the Microsoft Store to non-MSIX installers like EXEs and MSIs. And then they have the Winget repositories and the Enterprise App Catalog that is predominantly made up of EXEs and MSIs. So it just sends a bad message. And they don't really march to the beat of their own drum when it comes to some of these modern initiatives. So why would others? We'll see now with the advent of AI, if there's going to be large, drastic changes. The need to perhaps move up in standards from a hardware perspective may also help drive changes to the operating system as well. And they can use, hey, such productivity gains through these AI platforms as the carrot to get people to modernize in other ways and get to a modern Windows OS that doesn't rely on this old bedrock, I guess. But hey, I'll leave it there and let's go to scripts, tricks, and tips. So I touched on it last week in the scripts, tricks, and tips, but maybe to do so again because I don't think I shared the link, which is my bad. There was a recent Inside MSIX blog post published that shares the different stages or phases of an MSIX install, which they say is not really an install, that includes index staging and registration. So, in breakdown and maybe a look underneath the bonnet here to see how MSIX differs to traditional installs and also just kind of how it works. And on that topic, I saw the awesome Andreas Nick, who used to be a great source of information for AppV as well, published his own article where it looks like he maybe delved further based off of the information that was shared by Microsoft into the various processes that are utilized during an MSIX installation. It's a very interesting breakdown. I mean, some of it's like, hey, there's like 5 different processes, which by itself is not that surprising because, ironically, I was just talking about modernization and changes. If anything, it seems like bad practices have actually crept in more often in terms of efficiency and number of services that get spawned off. But also interestingly, he shared details on the use of SQLite database instances during the install of MSIX applications, which, that's not unique to MSIX. There's other platforms that do something similar, have kind of ad hoc small instances of databases running locally on the client side. But that's also a little bit worrying because if you've used platforms that do that, that adds another potential kind of breakpoint, point of failure, a bottleneck, and just another variable into the whole process that makes it harder to troubleshoot and can also lead to an increase in failures. And I saw Andreas himself was saying that if you've ever troubleshooted a failed install, you may have just been focused on what's in the logs, and really it's only pertaining to maybe one of the 5 components or processes that's being used. So you may have only been troubleshooting about 20% of the process itself. So if you work with MSIX and Windows Application Management, you want to check out both the Microsoft blog, and I'm sure there's going to be more blog posts from them on this topic coming because it seems like a landing page for that, but also for Andreas Nick's blog post too. So over the last few weeks, I've kind of been trying a different approach to scripting and researching for the podcast, and I feel like it's maybe not as good as what I was doing in the past. I feel like maybe I'm missing information or missing stories. So rather than spending a night or two with focused time researching stories and scripting the podcast over a couple of nights, I've instead been spending a little bit of time every day finding stories and then doing a short write-up. But then by the time it comes to record the podcast, I've kind of forgotten some of the information and the context from reading the article. So yeah, that's just to say if you've noticed a little bit of a difference over the last couple episodes, that's probably why. I really need to decide the future direction of this podcast and whether or not I keep doing it. But hey, that's for another day. Thanks so much for listening.